The thing that I think of first when I'm building my setting are the people. And it makes sense. I mean, people are the first thing that a lot of us encounter when we're experiencing a new setting for the first time. No matter how we're experiencing them, as a player or as a reader or as an audience of any description, the first thing that we see are the people in the world doing what they do. But who are these people? What are they doing, and how did they decide to do it? How do you come up with people to populate your setting, and more to the point, how do you make them feel real? In this episode of A Whole New World, we're going to go over how to populate your setting. From the mundane, everyday people to the remarkable monsters and supernatural beings, I'll show you how to make your setting come alive. Join me, Dungeon Master Lee, as I show you A Whole New World. In this episode of A Whole New World, I, Dungeon Master Lee, hope to give you the building blocks that you need to come up with your very own population. And by that I mean, I hope to give you the materials that you can use to come up with your own culture, your own way for humans to interface with the fantasy world that you're building. So, what do I mean by building blocks? There are a whole bunch of different theories on how to build a population in a fantasy world. Different places to start, different things that you should focus on, different ways for your average workaday human to interact with a world in which dragons exist. But in my years of traveling and researching, I've come up with a pretty good solution to how to begin to think about a fantasy population. And by come up with, I mean I have listened to smarter people than myself talk about this, and this is what they've said. So, what are the building blocks that you will need to have a stable fantasy population? First, you will need a source of food. Now, this sounds glib. This sounds like you're waving off something that should be considered simple, but in reality, it's a very complex and very important part of your culture's survivability. Because after all, if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, that's your priority. And stable culture can't exist without a source of food. So, all that is a long way of saying, what do your people eat? And you don't have to be super specific about it either. You can just say that your population eats fish. Your population harvests grain. Your population hunts. In one way or another, your population has a source of food that they have available to them, and they've come up with a solution in order to get that food reliably. So that's the first building block. How does your population survive? Where do they get their food? What strategies and techniques have they come up with to secure food for the people who don't need to farm? Because that is information that is fundamental to your fantasy population. Culture comes from food, but culture doesn't stop at food. That's where we come to the second building block. The material facts of your population. Now, this is a term that I have cribbed wholesale from author B.R. Sanders. I highly recommend you go look up their work. They're a self-published author and they are great. I had the great fortune of listening to one of their talks on world building, and this is a great way to think about the things that are not food, but have stemmed from food. These are the things that people have come up with when they don't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from. So, for example, our island-bound population of humans. They've come up with ships, they've come up with fishing, they know where they're eating the next meal, and they've come up with a pretty stable, sustainable thing that gets them bites of food in their mouth. So, what do they do when they're not fishing? Maybe they race boats. Maybe they have a whole culture of people who see how far and how quickly they can get from point A to point B over the ocean. Maybe they have stories about people who have gotten there so quickly and with such skill that they become mythology. And that's just one aspect of the material facts of a given culture. What structures or dwellings do they live in on the islands? What do they decorate them with? And I mean, if there's one constant in human life and culture, it's decoration, regardless of the techniques and traditions that you come from. What do the people prioritize when they're not trying to find out where their next meal or their next safe night's sleep comes from? Are they a particularly religious group of people? Are they a particularly That's a hard thing for me to say. As somebody with a lisp, particularly religious is a really weird thing to say. Are they a particularly religious group of people? Do they have a set of rules by which they live their lives? By which they've figured out how to live outside of securing food? So, for example, the main island that these people live on is also inhabited by a dragon. Now, this dragon isn't particularly hostile, this dragon isn't particularly active, but they know this dragon exists, or they know that someone far back on the chain of their written or verbal memory has encountered this dragon, and it was really impactful because it was a dragon. How has their society developed in response to this dragon? Do they like this dragon? Do they not like this dragon? Are they afraid of this dragon and want to keep it happy? Because maybe far back in your grandpa's grandmother's grandperson's time, this dragon attacked the village. It was unsure what these squiggly little primates were, and so it took a dislike to their activities. That sort of thing really impacts a culture. This culture is going to try and develop techniques and habits in order to cope with these circumstances that they may or may not have control over. So, okay. Island-bound culture. They get their food from fish and shellfish and maybe a little bit of agriculture. They also live in some semblance of harmony with this dragon that borders on, I don't know, a little bit of worship. I would worship a dragon. Dragons are tight. So we have some idea of who these people are, what they prioritize, and what they idolize. What they do when they're not looking for their next meal, and what they're concerned about that is kind of outside of their control. And this manifests in a whole bunch of different ways. This manifests in the stories they tell, this manifests in the decorations they make, this manifests in the different art and music that they create. I mean, if you have a song about a folk hero who sailed far out into the ocean, and what they found there, that's culture. And so those are 2 or 3 of the building blocks that I would say are the most important when coming up with your very own fantasy culture. What do they eat? What do they do when they're not eating? What do they come up with in terms of idealized behavior? What are they worried about that they don't really have that much control over? How do they adapt to the things that they don't have that much control over? All of this comes to light in the ways that this culture manifests itself. All of these aspects of making a fantasy world, all of this manifests in a world in which people, everyday people, react to the things around them. And the things around them don't have to be mundane. They can be very, very weird. I mean, what are we here for if not to have people living in a cool, crazy fantasy world? But there are a few constants that I suggest you kind of set your watch by. And those are the things that I just mentioned. No matter how weird or out there the fantasy setting gets, people are going to react to it. And it's going to start becoming mundane. People, if they survive, will come around to the fact that there are vampires out there, or that there are dragons at the top of that mountain. So, you have some idea of your fantasy setting's population. You have a culture, a group of people that have gotten together and have solved the problems of your fantasy world. Now, how do you get NPCs out of that? Despite the specifics of any given situation, a lot of times in different media, you'll find that the same archetypes are repeated again and again. For example, a shopkeeper with a bushy mustache that's a little portly and kind of officious is going to be a constant wherever you go. Now, they may not have a bushy mustache, but they may have some sort of other kind of ostentatious sign of their wealth. So, for example, in the Qing dynasty, a lot of times high-ranking officials would have long, lacquered fingernails, showing that they didn't have to participate in everyday work. In early Victorian England, people would blacken their teeth purposefully to show that they could afford sugar, or seem like they could, anyway. Regardless of the circumstances of the culture, people would try to ostentatiously show their wealth. A fussy, pompous shopkeeper will manifest as fussy and pompous regardless of what they use out of that culture to signify that they are being fussy and pompous. It's nice to know that we all have that in ourselves, you know? The fussiness and the pompousness, and like all of these different human characteristics that we manifest regardless of how we manifest them. And so I would encourage you, when coming up with an NPC, regardless of the fantasy culture that you've come up with, to come up with these archetypical, I don't know what the word for it would be. Archetypical figures. Archetypical figures are a good place to start, regardless of the culture that they come from. Because we've all encountered people that are a little too big for their britches. We've all encountered people that are humble and kind. We've all encountered people who are brave and stalwart. And we've all encountered people that are stubborn and unwilling to work with us. Regardless of the factors of the culture, these archetypes are a great place to start when you're coming up with individuals coming out of these cultures. I should define archetype. I don't think I did that yet. An archetype is a broad strokes character. It's a formulaic character that we're all familiar with. There's a website, tvtropes.org, that has a list of a bunch of different character archetypes that we as consumers of Western media are familiar with. Everything from the big bad evil guy, the BBEG, to the plucky young heroine. If you're looking for a good resource on archetypes to build NPCs for your setting, I would really recommend tvtropes.org. Just start clicking around. It's a giant rabbit hole you can dive headfirst down into. So, archetypes, formulaic characters that seem to manifest in any different culture that you can come up with. It's wrong to say that people manifest this way in real life. People are infinitely complex wherever you go. But when you're coming up with characters for a fictional setting, this is a great place to start. In addition to being a character that you as a GM are familiar with, this is also a character that your players are familiar with, and they know how to interact with them, without having to go into the specifics of the culture. This can be really handy when you're trying to build a culture from the ground up, because the alien things that your culture manifests don't necessarily have to be the first things that your characters encounter. Once you're done establishing the archetypes of the NPCs that you're building to populate your world, then you can start complicating. For example, what if your shopkeeper was one of the main figures in the rebellion against the tyrannical king? They're a fierce proponent of freedom, liberty, and individual agency, but you wouldn't be able to tell that just by buying bread from them. But the deeper and deeper you go into their storyline, you realize that they are one of the most stalwart defenders of the values that your player characters hold dear. Likewise, what if the shining knight figure, who is the champion of the people and is such an idol in the eyes of the everyday workaday folks, what if they end up burning a village to the ground and thinking that they're doing a good thing? What if they turn into the big bad evil guy? Isn't that a cool villain? And that character can manifest in any culture across the globe. The person who is an idealized figure who turns out to be somebody who is working against the interests of the everyday people, that's a really fun character, a really fun NPC to populate your world with. So you've come up with a culture and you've come up with individuals from this culture. Now, beyond that, one of the most important things when you're coming up with a population for a fantasy world is opinions. That sounds really silly. But I guarantee you one of the most important things to come up with when populating a world are the opinions of the people living inside of it. What do they think of when they think of your player characters? What do they think of about the policies that the king has just enacted? Having your NPCs, or even the culture at large, have an opinion on the events and circumstances of the world makes the world feel like it's living. It makes the world feel like you can walk down the street and ask any given person about the circumstances, and they'll be able to give you an answer. A good place to start when forming opinions for your NPCs is take any given element of your world, be it the culture or the fantasy elements or even the player characters, and give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or the cultural equivalent of that. Is any given person on the street in favor of this? Are they against this? Do they like it or dislike it? That's a great place to start. You can come up with why, and you can come up with what each individual person thinks is the right solution. But when you get right down to it, one of the most important things is just, do they like it? Do they like the dragon living at the top of the mountain? This builds the tapestry of what the world is at any given moment. Just what a shopkeeper in your given fantasy town is thinking and feeling. So, we've established the background culture of your setting. We've established the material facts, how the culture manifests, how they decorate, how they idealize, what they think about, what they do. We've established a couple of people that come out of this setting, and the archetypes that they are based upon. And after that, what their complications are that make them feel like real people, with thoughts and opinions. That all makes the mundane world. I don't want to call it the normal world because it's not normal. It's individual and unique and really cool and really beautiful. But it's mundane, and it's wonderful in that way. But it's just the mundane background of the population that you have built. Now, since we're playing an RPG, one of the things that you will want to consider while populating your world is what is remarkable. What I mean to say is this. Over here, we have the mundane. Outside of that is what your player characters are primarily going to be dealing with. This, the mundane world, it can take care of itself. The remarkable world, that's what the player characters need to take care of. So how do you come up with the remarkable in your world? When thinking about the remarkable for your setting, there are a couple of things that you should consider. First of all, is the remarkable thing a product of its environment? Take, for example, this island culture that we have come up with kind of off of the cuff. A monster for this setting might live in the ocean. It might be a giant marine predator. It might have tentacles, or a whole bunch of sharp teeth that wash up on the beach occasionally. Or it might be something that lives further inland, where most of the people don't typically go. Either way, it's something that is a product of where you live. Think about where it makes its home. Does it make its home in a cave on the seafloor? Does it make its home in the jungle inland on the island? Either way, it will have some physical adaptation to that. But in addition to the physical and setting-based attributes of this remarkable thing, how is it supernatural? That's the second thing that I consider when I'm coming up with things to populate my world with the supernatural and the remarkable, is though there are things that stem from the environment it's built from, it also manifests in a dangerous and alien way. Maybe there's this grotto, and in this grotto lives this being. They're not human, and they're not any of the sentient races that a normal person would be familiar with. Instead, there's something different. They aren't constrained by the limitations imposed by the natural world. They don't seem to age. They don't seem to die. They seem to be able to bestow really strange and uncanny blessings or curses on the people who seek them out. Though they're a product of the world, they seem to transcend it. So, how does your population of remarkable things transcend the limitations of its natural world? Can they heal the sick? Can they take the life from the world around them to feed themselves? And I mean in a way that's not just harvesting wheat. I mean in a way that's sucking the energy out of the wheat itself. Either way, think about the ways in which the remarkable things seem to subvert or pervert the natural order of the world that your mundane people live by. This is kind of a high concept thing, but you'll get the hang of it really quickly. For example, a vampire can just feed off of another living being. Most people can't do that. Even if you tried, at best you would get a really sticky this region, and a lot of people really mad at you. A ghost, for example, can walk through walls. That's crazy! Whatever supernatural or remarkable thing you populate your world with, make sure that it has some ability that is unattainable by the mundane. Now, whether it uses that ability to help or to hurt is completely up to this being, but make sure that it has something that the normal people in your world don't have. So, there you go. I think that's a pretty good way to start populating your fantasy setting. You have a culture. You have the material facts of the culture. You have the people that come from this culture and the normal things that they do in their day-to-day life. And outside of that, you have the things that stalk around the edges of the campfire. Whether they're good or bad, they're not mundane. And that's what your players are going to be dealing with, is the not mundane, the remarkable. And do I have a conclusion on this? Okay, hold on. Here's my conclusion. Populating your world is one of the funnest parts of world building. You start with how people eat and how people shelter themselves, and you end up with this entire constellation of existence. What do they believe in? And what do they love? What do they hold dear and what do they despise? And from this constellation, you can pull individual stars of people and places and things that are entirely unique to your setting, while still being universal to human experience at large. And whether it's universal or not, it's entirely yours, and it belongs entirely in your setting. I just think that's really gosh darn cool. So there it is. That's my introduction to populating your fantasy world. I'm split on which episode to do next in A Whole New World, whether it's how to make a good NPC, how to make a good monster, or how to make a good set of factions to start bouncing off of each other. Regardless, I hope you tell me what you come up with in the comments below, or hit me up on Twitter. I'll give a link to that profile on the little description down there. I love hearing what people come up with. This is one of my deepest joys when it comes to world building and RPGs. And with that, I bid you a fond adieu. I hope you tune in next time for the next riveting episode of A Whole New World, whatever it happens to be. Hope it's one of those. I hope that sounds good to you. Either way, thank you for watching. I hope you had a good time. I had a really good time doing this, and farewell. I never know how to close these episodes. Maybe I should keep talking. Maybe I shouldn't keep talking. Maybe I should just cut it there and... what do I want to say first? Sorry, my face itched and it distracted me. Oh, take it home, baby. We're almost there. Conclude. At the